Hello, everybody. Welcome to the 5th episode of Fully Endorsed. This is number 5, right?
I believe so. Maybe we're barely a couple episodes in, and already we're lost.
See, the Galaxy Quest, and then this is my 3rd recommendation, so it's number 5.
Okay.
I'm no good. I'm no good at this. So we will now begin talking about
Space Ghost.
Yes, specifically the 2005 Space Ghost miniseries, 6 issues that DC put out. DC, if you don't know, owns the comic rights to a bunch of classic Hanna-Barbera characters, all of them, I guess. And they've been doing runs on them for quite some time. Is this one of the first ones they did? Probably, right? 2005, I mean...
That's pretty early on. Honestly, I don't really keep a track of a whole lot of the Hanna-Barbera stuff. All I'm really aware of is that around the time Cartoon Network was getting off the ground, Cartoon Network was started by Warner Brothers, and Warner Brothers got the licenses for like a shit ton of classic cartoons, including the purchase of Hanna-Barbera's entire catalog during the 90s. Leading up to when Cartoon Network debuted, they had reruns of a ton of like MGM cartoons like Tom and Jerry, Droopy, a lot of the classic Looney Tunes and Hanna-Barbera stuff, and of course one of them happened to have been Space Ghost, and it was through that acquisition of Hanna-Barbera they were able to Adult Swim and pre-Adult Swim, they were able to do a lot of weird experimental stuff with a lot of Hanna-Barbera's characters, most famously being Space Ghost Coast to Coast. And that sort of also continued off when Adult Swim was established with the likes of Harvey Birdman, Attorney at Law. And I don't think C-Lab 2021 was based on anything, but it was definitely inspired by Hanna-Barbera series.
No, there was an old show. There was an old show called C-Lab 2020, and then 2021 was the Adult Swim sort of comedic take on it.
Oh shit, okay, I guess I was proven wrong then.
Indeed. Which, by the way, 2020, where's our C-Lab, damn it?
That is true, that is true.
But yeah, so yeah, as you were just saying, Cartoon Network ran a lot of old Hanna-Barbera cartoons back in the day, which is why I know who Magilla Gorilla is, and my mom doesn't. It created this weird bridge between my generation and my grandmother's generation. So did you watch a lot of Space Ghost growing up, Andres? As I did. I friggin' love Space Ghost, the character. He's one of my favorites from the Hanna-Barbera library. Of course, this was back when Hanna-Barbera at the time was doing a lot of really great action shows like Space Ghost and the Herculoids. Things like that.
Hanna-Barbera Godzilla, of course, which I'm sure a lot of our audience knows all about. I feel like I have definitely seen my fair share of Space Ghost. Unfortunately, it has been perhaps decades since I've seen the original since I've revisited the original Space Ghost. I can't imagine it being that long of a series. I remember like you and I were actually looking at like how long a lot of the Hanna-Barbera shows lasted, and majority of them didn't really go beyond like 13 episodes, really. And
Space Ghost had more. I'm trying to remember how many there are. Space Ghost was one of those shows that was sort of partnered with another show. So
right.
It was Space Ghost and Dino Boy, I think.
Right. And I'm looking at it right here, and apparently there were 42 Space Ghost episodes, and I'm assuming like these 42 episodes were like 15 minutes long in order to fit a half-hour block with Dino Boy. So these 42 episodes can comprise roughly 21 half-hour slots.
Yes, and Space Ghost was designed by a very prolific artist who was working at Hanna-Barbera at the time, named Alex Toth, who was also responsible for a lot of other shows that I was just mentioning, sort of the Birdman, Herculoids, C-Lab, that whole sort of era of Hanna-Barbera. He was very prolific in that sort of world.
So I guess he came to define the more realistic style of Hanna-Barbera's catalog.
Yes, although he sort of rides a line, especially with Space Ghost, between realistic but also sort of stylized. I think you can definitely see like influence from the way he drew Space Ghost in like what Bruce Timm eventually did with his take on Batman, and moving on into the rest of the DCAU and the other cartoons that have followed suit since then.
No, totally.
So he's had an enormous impact on the way these cartoons are done over the years.
Yeah, absolutely. However, I would definitely say the majority of my exposure to Space Ghost has definitely been the I want to say what year did they came out? I want to say like 1992 or 1993 series Space Ghost Coast to Coast, and it was a show that I was really mesmerized by as a kid because it was unlike anything I had ever seen before, because it was one of those things where I'm so used to seeing my cartoon characters be so crazy and over the top, but here we have a series where a lot of these cartoon characters are very down to earth and kind of talk more like the way regular people talk, very chill, very relaxed. And there was like this very weird, awkward, silenced nature to it all that I didn't appreciate until I was a kid. I was an adult in my 20s revisiting it, and I was like, holy shit, this is hilarious to me now.
Yeah, I just looked it up. Space Ghost Coast to Coast ran from 1994 all the way until 2008. So,
okay.
Pretty good run there. And yeah, it's interesting. You mentioned that whole idea of like these cartoon characters who are being very sort of real world and sort of chill. It's a style of humor that would be done again later, and perhaps to even greater effect in Harvey Birdman, Attorney at Law. Because the character of Space Ghost himself is inherently like over the top and crazy. He's a superhero in space. He's sort of Batman and Superman rolled into one,
right?
Running around in this very sort of Flash Gordon-y, Star Trek TOS sort of world. It's super out there and ridiculous and high concept. And so to take that character in particular and turn him into a talk show host was an interesting thing to do, and to have his sort of three most famous sort of rogues gallery members as the supporting characters on the show, Zorak, Moltar, and Brack.
Right, it was like fuck Jane, fuck Jace, fuck Blip. It's all about the villains here.
Yeah,
I bet you so many people know who Zorak and Moltar are, but they don't even know who Space Ghost's own sidekicks are.
It's true, and Brack would go on to have his own spin-off show for a while. So.
Right, Brack presents the Brack Show starring Brack.
Yeah, so you can't deny that Space Ghost Coast to Coast's role in sort of the legacy of Space Ghost, but we're not here to talk about.
Right, we're not here to talk about that Space Ghost. Although it's really funny because it was in Space Ghost Coast to Coast that they established the fact that Space Ghost's real name in that sort of bizarre continuity, his real name was Thaddeus Eustace Ghostal. And it's funny how in this comic, his real name is Thaddeus Bach or Back or Batch, Botch. But
it's Bach, like the composer.
Okay, but either way, it's pretty surreal to see that the real name established in Coast to Coast was carried over into the comic.
Yeah, at least partially.
Yeah.
yeah, that's cool. That's a nice touch. So yeah, I think that's enough introduction. Let's get into talking about this thing. On the whole, Andres,
yeah,
give your sort of blurb, back of the book feelings about the Space Ghost 2005 miniseries.
Let's see. I would say it is a wonderfully fleshed out, down to earth, but at the same time very fantastical reinterpretation of Space Ghost that perfectly modernizes him in a way that a new generation of readers can be entertained by.
Absolutely, I think that's a good way of putting it. It's interesting because it starts out in a way that makes you think that it's going to be this like super gritty, like overly dark, like Dark Knight Returns take on the character, and it certainly is that at some points. But then by the end of the story, it swings back around, and becomes very sort of classic and heroic, and Space Ghost becomes this much more sort of archetypal, like Superman-esque figure by the time it's all over with.
And it got me. Sorry.
It goes very dark early on, and then sort of careens into the sort of classic Space Ghost in a way that you can definitely watch the original show with this comic in mind, and it would make perfect sense, honestly, as an origin story for that character.
I'm assuming they never. Which is great. I'm assuming they never went into Space Ghost's origin in the original series.
Not that I know of. No, it's. I mean, the original series is very sort of the time. It's every episode he saves a planet from a thing, either a big space monster or one of the villains who recur. It never really got very deep into anything very psychological.
Right. You mentioned before that it's sort of like almost gritty Dark Knight tone, and then it comes back. It returns to the more classic style. I would say it's almost, the story arc is almost like a boomerang effect, where at the beginning of the story, we see Thaddeus Bach, who is a sort of space, like Buzz Lightyear, Flash Gordon-esque space ranger, who is essentially like a space cop. And so he's going around taking down criminals, and he's a model soldier. He's sort of like, he's very like Captain America in a way. He believes in, truth and justice and getting rid of the, putting order to the corruption. I even love the sort of the narration at the beginning, where it's like, what if all of the universe is corrupt, what is the point of our existence? Maybe there is some form of justice out there that seeps into us in some way in order to bring order to the chaos. And it's sort of like he has this very noble, very model, how would you say this? When you believe in a sense, you have like strong moral integrity. You believe in the just right cause, and then something traumatic happens which leads him to abandon his morale, his ethics, his code of honor, and then he comes right around to returning to maybe not the man that he was before, but a different, perhaps even better version of who he was before. Or at least like a wiser version.
I suppose you could call it a crisis of faith. He is this character in the beginning who believes very much in sort of the tenets of, like, as you said, truth and justice and the American way, even though it's in the middle of space. And he has everything ripped away from him, and goes into this very dark place and comes back as this sort of vengeful spirit in a way, only to then realize that he's going about things all wrong, and that he needs to go back to his core beliefs in order to win the day. The theme of the story, I believe, at least from my interpretation, is this idea of revenge versus justice. In that he believes in justice at the beginning, and then he loses sight of that and spends the whole middle part of the story seeking revenge instead. And then at the end of the story, he has to return to the ideal of justice in order to become the hero that he's meant to be.
Right, and I definitely got, like, it's a very classic story. It reminded me so much of The Punisher and Mad Max, especially with the whole dead family origin that they gave him.
Yeah, now that's something I want to talk to you about, because I can see somebody leveling the criticism at this book of a certain trope.
Yeah.
We hear about it a lot.
Oh, yeah.
We hear about it a lot in the comics industry, and sometimes in the movie industry. And the most recent example I can think of is that Deadpool 2 drew some fire for this. The fridging trope, which, if you're not aware, is the trope of killing a woman or harming a woman in order to spur a male character into action. This is named after something that happened to one of the Green Lanterns. You could perhaps accuse this story of falling into that trap, because it's all about his pregnant wife being murdered by this group.
Right, and it's like... sorry, I was going to say this is like a very traditionally macho, masculine character, and so by robbing him of his family, you rob him of his duty as a man to watch over his family. He is left with no purpose, so he's got to redeem himself and reclaim his manhood, stuff like that, you know?
Here's why I don't think it's a problem, though.
Uh-huh.
First of all, that trope doesn't typically bother me anyway. But I know
maybe it's just because you're a sexist man.
Maybe. I don't know. It's just not something that I usually pick up on, so I don't usually bother to even criticize it, and then somebody else brings it up to me, and I'm like, oh, I guess. Like, it's just not something I typically look out for. I only really thought about it when reading this again because I knew that we were going to be reviewing it, so I was sort of looking at it a bit more critically.
Right.
I think it's different, though. I think it's different than like the Kyle Rayner finding his girlfriend in the fridge thing, in that it's a part of his origin story and thus is a bit more Batman or Spider-Man, you know?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that really makes a difference, but I feel like it does. How do you feel? Like,
for me personally, it comes with the idea of a cliche, you know. It's like, or cliche. It's like any cliche, like any trope, you know. It all depends on how it's executed. Like, sure, when you do something multiple times, you begin to get sick of it. And I can understand how for some people they see this so many times and they are sick of seeing characters and relationships get treated this way in fiction. For me personally, I haven't encountered this as much, but I do know that especially for heroes, for like the hero's journey, for heroic characters, the death of a loved one is usually a very easy, very relatable, very common road to take when writing a character who becomes a hero by the end. Like, we have Superman, he loses his entire race, his parents. Batman lost his parents. Spider-Man lost his Uncle Ben. Heck, we even had Kamen Rider, who lost the person who helped freed him from the Shocker organization. So many characters go through a personal loss that then adds to their personal growth. And for me, that can be seen as cliche potentially, and that could bother others. But for me, it's like, I always see that as like good motivation and a good starting point. It's an easy a cliche maybe, but it's a very easy. It's a good starting point to spur a character's transformation. And so again, if it's used well for the sake of the character, regardless if it's male or female, I'm all for it, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, you can even go back way further to, like, ancient, like, mythological stories. Hercules is hypnotized by Hera and ends up killing his entire family. And that sort of sets him down his path
of redemption.
Perseus, his entire kingdom is destroyed when he's just a baby. Very very sort of Superman-esque.
Moses, he was given up as a child because every other child was being killed around that time due to that, I believe, is a prophecy of some kind.
Yeah, and then is raised by surrogate parents, also very Superman-esque.
Mm-hmm.
Which is very intentional, obviously. Superman's creators were Jewish after all.
That's true.
But yeah, this is a trope that is as old as time. And I think especially in this sort of story where the entire point is about a man who is robbed and has everything taken from him and goes on like a revenge quest, you kind of have to do something like this to set that sort of a story in motion.
True, yeah. Someone who is dead inside. Like, the theme of death and rebirth is a very strong theme here throughout this comic. And actually, it does give a lot of weight to the name of Space Ghost. There are multiple times where he talks about, like, I'm dead, or the man you knew is no more. I'm not the man that you killed. The man you killed died on that planet. I came back as a completely different individual altogether. the idea of like, dead bodies and ghosts and vengeful spirits and all that kind of stuff. It all ties well into this journey he goes through.
Yeah, I agree. So I that sort of covers that, I think. I wanted to address that as up front as possible, because that's probably the biggest sort of criticism that I could see somebody levying at this thing.
Yeah.
And it's definitely there, but I don't think it's a problem in this case.
Oh, it's funny, like, as soon as they were talking about the future and hopefully having a son, I was like, okay, she's gonna die soon. This always happens. Whenever people are, like, really happy and they're talking about the future, something's gonna go wrong.
Well, and also, it's an origin story of Space Ghost, and then you're introduced to his pregnant wife at the beginning, and you're like, Space Ghost didn't have a wife or a son or a daughter.
Well, unless you remember Space Ghost to Coast, in which case, like, I believe, like, what was it, Bjorn? Bjorn was his wife, I believe, at one point.
Yeah, that's true. That is true.
Bjork, it was Bjork.
But no, normal Prime Space Ghost, Space Ghost Prime.
Pre-52 Space Ghost. Or
pre-52 Space
Ghost. No, this is the 2005 comic. This is pre-52. Pre-Crisis Space Ghost.
Right. Silver Age. Golden Age. No, it's Silver.
No,
Silver Age Space Ghost.
Because we're in space! And that's all Silver Age is.
Exactly.
Lots of sci-fi in the Silver Age.
Yeah, but since we were already kind of talking about it, I guess we can transition into the sort of writing in general. Mm-hmm. I think this book is pretty well written, honestly. It's written by a guy named Joe Kelly. Now, I'm sort of, I read comics occasionally, but I don't really keep up with the individuals in the industry like some people do. So the name didn't necessarily ring a bell for me. But then I looked him up, and this is a pretty prolific guy. He's written for Deadpool, X-Men, Action Comics. He was one of the creators behind Ben 10, apparently.
Oh, wow.
So
cool.
He's credited as having worked on Superman versus the Elite. I don't know if he was the only writer on that, because I haven't seen that. But this is a guy who has done quite a bit of work in the field, it seems. Mm-hmm. How did you feel that he did here overall? I
think he does a good job at balancing the dialogue and the world building in terms of creating a story where its world and characters are relatable enough for us to connect with, and yet foreign enough to feel fantastical. There are certain characters that do not talk in perfect English, and it does these characters do come across as being of a foreign nature. They do definitely set a precedent for, like, these are the characters that are more closely relatable or more closely based on our culture, and then any other culture from that you can tell, okay, these are like foreign characters to these quote-unquote regular characters. And so
including Space Ghost's wife.
I was gonna say that she sounded her dialogue seemed very off, so I was like, is English not her first language?
She's written with, like, I read it as like a Russian accent.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking too.
Yeah, it's an interesting choice. I don't know what the backstory is there, obviously, because there is none. I don't know if she's from, like, a different planet or whatever, because nobody else that we meet talks like that.
It's very special honor. You're here, baby. Be proud.
Yeah.
Like, you will not die, or you'll never do nothing to make me cry. I'm from Space Yugoslavia. Space Slavia.
Is that near Space Australia?
Yeah, exactly. It's right around the corner from Space Australia.
It's extra weird because she's the only human character who does that. Everybody else who talks weird in the book is an alien.
Right.
Whether it's just, sometimes they'll just put, like, the little, like, parentheses around the dialogue to let you know that they're speaking in an alien language, or there's one alien in particular that he's fighting at the beginning of the first issue whose the font is, like, really weird and you have to, like, squint at it to read it.
Or there's this like purple alien with like green ugly speech balloons, so you know he's definitely got a weird accent or a filter through. Oh no, rather there's the cyborg with a weird like he's definitely got some mechanical filter through his voice.
Yeah, but Elua is the only human character with an accent. That's interesting. I wish I could talk to Mr. Kelly and ask him what the thought process was there.
Right, yeah, because that was like one of the big things that stuck out for me the whole time. It's like, although it is kind of interesting that you have yeah, you're right, you have a human character who has an accent, whereas usually anything that's not human is the ones with an accent.
Right.
Yeah. And I definitely have living in Japan, I've talked to a fair share of foreign people, or a lot of people from different cultures with English, various levels of English fluency, and so I have come across people with this sort of like understandable yet slightly broken English.
Right. But weird sort of quirks and accents on characters who maybe shouldn't have them aside. The writing in this book overall is pretty strong, I think. He does this interesting thing, because there's a lot of like thematic stuff going on in this book. There's some really heavy things happening, but he never devolves into full like the characters don't sound like Rorschach from Watchmen. You know what I mean? Like they're not just going around all the time. They're not just going around all the time like the cosmos is diseased and I'm the cure or whatever. Like they don't just go around spouting the themes at you the entire time. It's a bit more subtly done than that. They do feel like real people a lot of the time, but at the same time there are some amazing lines in there. Like I wrote one down in particular. There's a line late in the book, like issue 5 or 6, when Space Ghost is fighting Zorak, and he says, "My death means nothing. I will stand judged by how I live." And how great of a line is that? And really, sort of, what a great way to encapsulate sort of the theme of the piece in one very heroic line. It's a highlight of the book.
Most definitely, yeah. And I would say, like, only on the first page does the writing ever sound like more Shakespearean, and it doesn't really do that a whole lot.
And I'm pretty sure that opening narration is being provided by the character of Salomon,
right?
Who we will talk about in a little bit.
Yeah.
Who kind of always talks that way. True. He's like the one exception to the rule that I'm talking about here. He is very sort of thematic, I suppose. Right.
And what else did I want to mention before? I was thinking of when I was reading through a lot of this, I would say Space Ghost himself, or Thaddeus, he's definitely he embodies the classic machismo space action hero explorer sort of individual. And, he's kind of like, it's really cool because, he starts off as sort of a Buck Rogers sort of, space ranger, a space law enforcer, and he ends up going from Buck Rogers to Batman to Superman by the end.
I'm sorry, finish your thought. Were you about to say
No, I was just going to say, like, during the middle portion of it is when it starts to feel like the most Batman, or, sort of like a vigilante revenge story. It was really nice to see this. Even darker than Batman at points. It almost feels like Space the Crow for a minute. Like, oh, yeah. Right. And, what was another thing here that I wanted to bring up? But I do like the one where it's like he's dealing with the 4-armed henchwoman, and by the time during her when she falls to her death, she's like, congratulations, you're finally one of us," indicating that he was always. They try to pull a Batman Year One on him, where much like with Commissioner Gordon, the other guys at the Gotham precinct want to get him involved into the corruption, and they try to do the same for him by having him join the Wrath, which is like a corrupt organization of essentially corrupt police officers backed by a corrupt portion of the government. And so once he doesn't comply, then that's when they leave him they kill his pregnant wife and leave him for dead.
Right, right. There's a lot of interesting world building, especially in the first 3 issues. We're introduced to sort of this governmental body called the Commandment. We don't know much about them, like how much of space they rule, but they seem to be fairly large. We're introduced to the Peacekeepers, which are essentially the police force of this government, who Space Ghost is a member of at the beginning of the story.
Right.
We're then introduced to the Eidolon, which I guess that's how you pronounce it, which is sort of a special ops group within the Peacekeepers. And then we go one step beyond that, and we're introduced to the Wrath, who you just mentioned, yes, they're essentially corrupt police officers.
Or I guess they act as the Black Ops team.
Yeah, even darker than that, though. Like, they get into some really messed up shit by the end of the story, we find out. So, it's really interesting.
I love how, like, throughout the early issues, they're hinting at the bugs, which they just sort of disregard as nothing but rumors to scare a portion of the population in this sort of galaxy. And by the end, they're hinting at it, and I'm thinking, what are these bugs? They're probably going to end up as sort of like a generic monster insectoid race, like the bugs from Starship Troopers. And it's funny because I was getting so involved in this sort of original world they built for Space Ghost that I completely forgot about everything else about Space Ghost's mythos. So by the time it's revealed that the bugs are Zorak and his people, I was like, oh shit, it's Zorak!
Oh, that's interesting. That's because the first time I read this, I definitely picked up on that they were talking about Zorak from the beginning. So it's interesting that you that was an effective reveal for you. That's cool to hear.
Yeah, I will say, like, I like the sort of the broken English used for Zorak. I love how they translate even when his foreign language, his people's foreign language is translated for the reader. It's nothing but it's like cut, kill, destroy, slay the soft fleshies. It's very simplistic, very hive-minded, very like they're on a one-minded kill track on their minds. But I was a little bit disappointed that at no point does Zorak ever recite the line, "I am the lone locust of the apocalypse. Think of me when you look into the night sky."
Yeah, it's they did a lot with the Zorathians, as they're called here. I don't know if they were called that in the original show. I don't remember. But Zorak's race, they do a lot with them in making them like really frightening and really sort of compelling as a sort of villainous force. They're basically just monsters of they're like the embodiment of like consumption. They eat entire planets and then they nest there for a while until they've consumed all the resources, and then they go to a different planet and start the process all over. It's horrifying.
No, absolutely.
And they're really...
It reminded me so much of like Legion from Gamera 2, where the Legion, they do nothing but move from planet to planet, eat up all its resources, reproduce, and then blast off into the next planet. Right.
And then it's also kind of similar to the Harvesters from the Independence Day franchise, I guess.
Yeah.
So they're very frightening. They're very ugly. They gave them these like enormous like horse heads in this book, and they're just terrifying to look at.
Right, and the best part is their faces have lack any human like expression to them. It just feels like it's an effective way of making these creatures as cold and as evil as possible by making them unable to unsympathetic and unable to really to connect with them as you just look into their cold, dead stares.
Yeah, and they're super stoked on eating people, which is always
right.
Which is always off-putting.
And I love how highly they view themselves above non-arthropod like creatures, or the fleshies as they call them.
Yeah, the meat.
The fleshies.
Yeah. That's all good stuff. That's all really good stuff. They never say this in the book, but this is sort of a headcanon that I got while reading it. I feel like at some point in the past, the galaxy had dealt with these creatures, and that's why there's like all this talk about the bugs. And then over the years, it had sort of time had gone on, and people had sort of forgotten, and people thought that it was just a myth. And then all of a sudden, here they are again, back and meaner than ever.
Right.
They also did a really interesting thing with them in that they introduced this sort of hive mind concept.
Right. I wanted to talk about that.
Throughout the book, we see Zorak die on several occasions, but Zorak can't really die in this as long as there are other Zorathians, because as soon as his body dies, one of the other Zorathians will then become Zorak, and I guess because it's a hive mind situation, they sort of absorb his personality and his thoughts and his memories. And so Zorak is constantly, several times, getting killed and chopped in half and everything, and then a few panels later, he's just back.
Right.
Just walking around.
Yeah,
it makes him much more compelling as a villain because it makes him that much harder to destroy.
Right. At first, I didn't know if it was just another one of his children that just take up the mantle, or is it like a psychic projection thing?
I'm pretty sure it's supposed to be him hopping into the different bodies, because they're very clear to mention that there's a hive mind going on. It's not just if I die, then he will become Zorak. It seems to be more involved than that. And like, whenever a new Zorak appears, they don't feel any different than the first Zorak. It very much feels like it's the same personality being transferred into these different bodies, you know?
Right. It's like, there was one line where, do you remember the scene where this particular Zorak dies by the ship that, like Temple tries to ram both Space Ghost and Zorak with his ship, but he only ends up, like, cutting Zorak in two. And before he gets cut, he recites the line, When we next meet, the pain I will visit upon you will be of legend, if there is any part of you left to see. So I was wondering, is
right.
he... at this point, I wasn't sure if, like, when he says next we meet, I wasn't sure if it's, like, when we meet in the afterlife, or if, like, we meet in our next fight when the next person takes over for me. Like, I wasn't sure, like, what we stood for. We meaning the Zorathians and Space Ghost, or just him and Space Ghost personally. Because at this point, it wasn't clear to me that his mental psychic projection would just hop into another body, so he thinks it's still the two of us.
Right. I suppose you could interpret it either way.
Like when he says,
to me, it feels
like when he says when next we meet. When I read that, I thought, oh, he's thinking about the two of them in hell or whatever, meeting in hell.
That could be, I suppose. I suppose that is one way of interpreting it. But as I said, to me, it feels like he's actually hopping into the different bodies.
It does make sense.
They even sort of change physically, because Zorak doesn't look like the other Zorathians.
Right.
He's a little bit bigger. He's colored like a different shade of green. He has like armor. And he also has 4 arms, which I don't think the other ones had, or even if they did, they didn't all have like the big pincer things like he had. But all the Zoraks that we see look the same, so it seems like there's a physiological change involved as well.
That is true about that. And let's see. As for other alien designs, most of them are really good. A lot of them give off a bit of that Star Wars feeling. They're all humanoid. So they all have like a humanoid basis, and it's kind of very typical of like almost like a live action movie where most aliens are just comprised of either makeup or prosthetics or puppeteering. It's very fun to look at this style of aliens here. Very Star Wars, very Doctor Who and the like.
Yeah, and there are some very creative ones. I like that one little henchman that we have for a while. He gets killed, like the 3rd or 4th issue, but the little psychic guy with the 4 eyes.
Right. I wasn't sure what was the point of Temple injecting him with that syringe. I guess that was meant to heighten his psychic powers, because his left eye gets fucked up for a while, and then all his eyes eventually get fucked up before he dies.
Yeah, well, I believe it was stated, because at one point in the book, Temple and the team come across a colony that has been slaughtered. And there's like a survivor there, and there's a survivor there who warns them about the bugs. And that's like the first hint of like, oh, the bugs are real, And they mentioned that ever since that happened, he's been having trouble with his psychic visions. I guess because he's been traumatized or something is the idea.
Yeah, or like he's picking up the last memories and thoughts from the traumatized people, so that affects him as well.
Yeah, and so I think the injection is supposed to help him with that.
I see then. I see.
But that's just a theory. A comic theory. Yeah, so you mentioned Temple. What a great villain, right? Like,
yeah, is it me or it's like when I read his dialogue, I was like imagining like DCAU Lex Luthor.
Sort of, yeah.
Like,
and then at other times, he kind of felt like Arlie Ermy from Full Metal Jacket. He's got that sort of gruff, like military type thing going on, but then below the surface of that is just this evil, like a monster.
Bastard, yeah, a complete bastard of a human being.
He's a real sack of shit.
Yeah, and like his interactions, I love his interactions with Zorak, where the two of them, they make a sort of alliance, but they're constantly trying to backstab each other as they try to come up with a plan that would only leave them to solely benefit from the situation. And it reminded me of like the collab between Lex Luthor and Gorilla Grodd during Justice League Unlimited.
Right, yeah, the third season when they're fighting for control of the Legion of Doom. Yeah,
right.
It is sort of similar to that. I always love when you have one villain who's sort of down on his luck at the moment, and he's been captured by the other villain who's like got like a whole army and shit, and he has to like negotiate for a chance to turn the situation in his favor. That's always a fun trope.
Yeah,
and they did a good job of it here, I think. We find out that he's got this entire planet that he's enslaved, and somebody mentioned something about a factory, so I guess they're making like weapons or something for him.
Mm-hmm. That part is never clear. It's not sure what exactly he benefits from this lost planet of slaves.
Yeah, it's definitely a switch, because early on in the story, he's just like, a bastard who sort of goes too far in the line of duty and has no qualms about killing people. But then over the course of the story, you realize that he's even more evil and corrupt than you originally thought.
Mm-hmm. Right. And I like the idea that Zorak has almost an amount of respect for Space Ghost and Temple, because neither of them, like the Zorak, they love preying upon they love instilling fear into the hearts of their victims, because it only like proves their perceived superiority over every other race. So the fact that Temple and Space Ghost show like no fear in them, in him and his race whatsoever, it's like, oh, I have respect for you two. You sort of amuse me, so I'm not going to kill Temple just yet. I'm going to play around and see what makes him tick. And I love how during Space Ghost's transformation into a full-blown selfless hero, once he reaches the point where he is fighting for others, his mind is no longer has this sort of this rage-fueled bloodlust after Temple. Once he lets go of that, Zorak then starts to look down on Space Ghost, because he feels like he is no longer the heartless being that that Zorak could relate to. Right.
Yeah, and there's a bit of irony in that he actually winds up helping save the planet from the Zorathians, because he, in an attempt to screw everybody over, messes with the energy core on their ship and causes it to begin to explode. I think my favorite bit for Temple is when after they have him in captivity, we find out that he has escaped by cutting off his own hand.
Yeah,
and then he takes one of the dead Zorathians' like claw thing and
duct tapes it
and attaches it to his arm.
Right.
And start using it like it's his own. Like what a legend!
What a bloody legend!
That's an alpha move right there.
Right, the Chad move, the Virgin Space Ghost versus the Chad Temple.
Exactly. And sort of henchmen that we start the story out with are pretty cool and menacing as well. I don't remember their names.
Right. Yeah.
Especially the first one that Space Ghost kills when he comes back. That dude is creepy.
Right.
Especially in the scene early on when we find out that he's just killed Space Ghost's wife, and he comes in and his mechanical arm is opened up, and you see all these like torture implements sticking out of it.
Right, and they're clean. And it's great. He's wiped them clean.
It's great because we don't know what he did.
Yeah.
But your imagination goes to work immediately. And he has this line where it's like, because Space Ghost didn't, and his wife didn't yet know what the gender of the child was. He comes in and he's like, it was a boy. And you're like, oh my God.
Very true, yeah. I love how, like, as gritty as this comic gets, it never pushes the envelope too far. I would say this is still within the realms of, like, a PG-13 action film, but like a hard PG-13.
Sure. It's like Return of the Joker dark, you know?
Yeah.
In that it's like super dark. In that it's super dark and disturbing, but never like gratuitous.
Right. Or in the case of like Mask of the Phantasm, a lot of the deaths are like implied or off screen.
Right.
Yeah, in fact, like when Space Ghost came back and is torturing like the cyborg guy, he does come off as like, especially with the hood, the extra hood he has around his hood, which kind of doesn't make sense, but okay. It's very Mask of the Phantasm, that original design of his.
Right. So I guess we should get into now sort of his transformation into Space Ghost. The first most important thing is that for some reason they don't kill him completely. They leave him for dead,
right.
Which, you know, is stupid, but it's a trope, and we kind of need it to happen that way for the story to progress. So
right.
I'll allow it. This planet is a pretty inhospitable place. They probably didn't know that one guy had survived, and so as far as they knew, there was no way for him to come back from this. We're then introduced to the character of Salomon, who is the last survivor of this planet. He has a very interesting backstory. And this planet is, of course, the Ghost Planet, which was a fixture of the original Space Ghost, Silver Age Space Ghost's continuity. The Ghost Planet was the planet that he and Jan and Jace had their base on, and where they kept all their technology. And so this is our introduction to that. And this the Salomon guy nurses him back to health, and he spends some time with him, and then he eventually takes him to the ruins of his old lab, and he shows him all this technology that he designed, and we find out that he is actually responsible for creating the weapons that have laid waste to this planet, and he has an enormous amount of guilt around that. And it's an interesting relationship between him and Space Ghost, because he's afraid to show him this because he knows that Space Ghost is going to take that tech and want to use it for revenge, and he doesn't want anybody else to be hurt because of his weapons.
Right. And you know what? It reminds me, he's kind of like, for Godzilla fans out there, he's like a Dr. Serizawa whose worst fears came to pass.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the other cool thing about the story, is that even though it goes down this hole in like the third and fourth issue of like being a dark like revenge fantasy story, it never paints that as, the story itself never really paints that as like a glorious sort of thing. I mean, it's very fun to read.
Yeah,
it's very fun.
It's not like Batman Year One. Or it's not like Mad Max, where it's like, yeah, go get him, Max. Yeah, kick his ass. Yeah. It's like here, it's always looked down upon.
It's not Kill Bill. It's because both Salomon is very sort of, he's very against it. We get constantly sort of flashbacks, auditory flashbacks of Space Ghost's wife, and at one point he even has a dream about her and completely shows that she is not about it either.
Right. It's very, you know, the part where she like opens her gown and you see like the potential ghosts of Jan and Jace. It's very like a Ghost of Christmas Present, if you remember that scene from A Christmas Carol.
Yeah, I thought the same thing. Yeah, it's interesting. So she's like a force ghost or whatever, and she's telling him, you know, don't do it.
I ain't cool about this, Jack.
I ain't cool about this. So yeah, that's nice. And it serves as a good.
What do the kids say these days? That's not very cash money of you.
Right. But yeah, so
this is very undope, bro.
Very undope. So I like this as both an explanation for A, how Space Ghost survived, and B, how he gets the tech to become Space Ghost. Because, of course, his powers of invisibility come from the belt, and all of his energy manipulation powers come from the power bands. And one of those two things also allows him to fly. It's not really clear. He also had the power of teleportation in the comics, I think, which isn't really... They don't really go into that here.
Yeah, it's a little
although
bit
maybe they do.
It's a little overpowered for this sort of thing. I know there's a part where it seems like he was teleporting in front of the children when they're like, "No, don't go, Space Ghost." But I think he was just turning invisible.
Yeah, there are two instances in here where I think maybe he teleported. Because there's a part early on in the fight with Temple where he blows up like a huge portion of the forest, and Space Ghost survives without any explanation. That could have been teleportation, or it could have been his force field at work. But then the other one is how he escapes the big explosion at the end is never explained. And it could be that he teleported in that instance as well. I don't know. They don't really go into that.
I see.
But yeah, that's the explanation for how he gets the tech. And for a while, we get this sort of dark, like, metal Space Ghost with the hood that comes down and, like, the black line cape, and he's all like, "I'm dead," like, or whatever. and
like, the man you left there died. I am Space Ghost. No, he never calls himself Space Ghost. I do like how, as silly of a name Space Ghost is, it's only appropriate that it came from the children that he rescued, who just so happened to be Jan and Jace from the cartoon.
Right, and it comes from like a
legend, a boogeyman legend.
Exactly.
I love the line. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say I like that as an explanation for where the name comes from. It makes a lot of sense. It fits very well into the universe, and it ties thematically also into all the themes of like death and rebirth and all that are going on here.
Right, and I do like that line where it's like, "Oh, the Space Ghost is someone who doesn't have a face. I have a face. No, you don't." I just love how much of a smart aleck Jane is in this comic. She's got quite the mouth on her.
Yeah, and then he doesn't show them his actual face until later on. I believe,
right.
Or it might even be the next page. I don't remember. It was when they were in that cave. You know what? Actually, I think it was the next night after he saved them from the bugs in that one panel, and they're back in the cave, and he like heats up a rock so that they can have some light. Might have been at that point.
Oh, one little side note. In terms of like the violence depicted in this comic, that's always sort of implied. There was another scene where Jane and Jace went to look for their parents, and next time we see them, they're talking to Space Ghost saying, "We couldn't tell who was who."
Right. That's a dark line, and you know what they're talking about because there are some scenes during the Zarathians' initial invasion of the planet. Meridian is the name of the planet, where there's one panel in particular where Zorak is standing there and he's like holding a guy in one claw, and then in the other claw you just see the dude's leg.
Right.
So like we do get a little bit of the carnage in that scene, specifically I think to sort of give you a feel for what these creatures are capable of.
Right. And let's see. And yeah, as for the kids themselves, I don't think we have talked about them much, but they do serve a really crucial role in Space Ghost's journey, his self, like his redemption. And it's nice that like sort of like it makes sense, like the innocence of a child's innocence can bring back those sort of like optimistic feelings from Space Ghost to remind him of the man that he used to be and the optimistic sense of justice he used to believe in.
Right. And it makes a lot of sense that forging a connection with some kids is what sort of brings him around on this issue because, one of the things that set him down the path to begin with was not just losing his wife, but his, unborn son. Right, and it's sort of like
he's finally becoming the father that he never was to his own son. His biological son.
Right. So that's nice. That's a nice bit of writing there as well. It feels a lot like Alan Grant from Jurassic Park. Those scenes where it's him and the kids, you know.
Totally. I didn't realize that until now. Holy shit.
Especially the panel, like after he finally shows them their face. Well, it's great. They say, "Can I see your face?" And then you just cut to him without the mask on, and they're like huddled in the corner of the cave, like sleeping.
Right.
And it reminds me a lot of of Grant in the tree with the kids in Jurassic Park.
Yeah. Yeah, very spot on comparison right there.
Yeah. So that's how he gets the tech to become Space Ghost, and then eventually gets his morality back, gets his groove back,
right.
As it were. We've talked at length now about the writing. Let's go into the art.
Yeah.
The artist on this book is named Ariel Olivetti. Again, the name didn't ring a bell, but when I looked into it, he's pretty prolific. He's worked on Daredevil, X-Men, X-Man, Space Ghost, and Punisher War Journal. So he's done quite a bit of work.
Funny
He's got an interesting style here.
Sorry, go ahead.
He has an interesting style here. It's painted. It's very well done for the most part. It's sort of Alex Ross-y, but more stylized than that. It's not 100% realistic.
Right. I mentioned before in the past that it felt like Alex Ross meets by way of Bruce Timm, where it's definitely got sort of like stylizations. A lot of the characters have more very exaggerated bodies and silhouettes to them, especially the human characters. You look at, let's say, Bruce Timm's Batman, and you look at Space Ghost early on, you can see they're almost cut from the same cloth, especially when you look at how that very strong chiseled chin of theirs. And
right, and I think it fits Space Ghost a lot because, as I said before, the original Space Ghost design has a pretty clear influence on the way Bruce Timm designed those characters.
Also, take a look at. Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say that and the old Fleischer Superman cartoons as well. But it's interesting. It comes full circle, you know.
And I want you to take a look at this page and tell me this does not think you. Tell me that isn't straight up BTAS Batman.
See the page in particular that you're talking about?
Yeah, this is from page 5, issue 5.
Yes, if you're reading along at home. Page 5, issue 5.
Yeah, the link I sent you on Skype, where it's like I was going to say Batman. Space Ghost is making a series of expressions that feel like they came right out of Batman the Animated Series.
Oh yeah. I love what they do with the eyes here. Yeah, it's good stuff. Yeah. Overall, I would say the art in this book is pretty strong. It doesn't always work though.
There are certain portions where like the proportions get a little inconsistent. Like here's an example I found that I'm sending to Dylan right now, where Space Ghost looks like overly buffed out. Like he looks almost like an inflatable doll at this point.
Yeah, that does happen sometimes. Also, sometimes facial expressions look a little weird. There's one scene, I can't remember which issue it's in, but there's a panel of Jan and Jace looking like shocked into the camera, and that sort of shocked expression doesn't really translate. They come across really rubbery and sort of uncanny valley. They're pretty frightening in that one panel, which is weird because for the most part they're drawn pretty well. They're some cute kids for the most part, but in that one scene they just look really odd.
Very true. The biggest weakness for this comic would be the photoshopped elements, and unfortunately, I was getting like flashbacks to the 1994 fan comic for Godzilla. For the Godzilla 94 fan comic, with it's got dozens upon dozens of photoshopped elements, or like elements that were just taken out of like a 3D program with the characters' models or character drawings slapped on there. And
you're referring to some of the like the backgrounds and stuff like that.
yeah, like I'm gonna send you an image right now once more on Skype, which shows like the trees, the valleys, the mountains. All of it is just pure Photoshop, and I couldn't understand. Well, I can understand why, because it's an easy shortcut. I'm assuming. Like a lot of this I've noticed like near the end of the comic. Most of the beginning issues did not have that many photoshopped elements, but as we got towards the end, the more they used like nature shots, all the nature stuff was photoshopped, I noticed. And I guess maybe this was a weakness of the artist. Maybe the artist just had a troubled time drawing trees and grass and more natural stuff, and maybe this, or I can understand like as an art, I can understand for an artist that drawing individual leaves and stuff that takes a lot of time, and maybe he or she. I'm not sure if Ariel is a man or a woman. I'm not sure. I apologize.
It's a man. It's a man.
Okay, so I can only assume that he was pressed for time and this was the only way in order for him to finish on time.
Because all the backgrounds in the early issues look really great, and I mean, again, most of that takes place in like futuristic, like cityscapes as opposed to nature. So perhaps you're correct. I would have to look at some of his other art to make a judgment on that. It's also possible, I don't know how much money this thing had behind it. I don't know what DC was throwing at this project. It could be that they were sort of, hesitant with the budget because maybe they needed the Space Coast IP to prove itself a little bit, doing a comic about Space Coast in 2005 might have been seen as kind of a risk, perhaps. So maybe maybe they did, maybe they didn't pay him enough for backgrounds. I don't know. I don't know what the story is.
Yeah, although, do you think that it's possible that this was always planned to be just 6 issues, or do you think there was a chance that this could have gone on to go longer than it should be?
I think this was definitely meant to be 6 issues, because at the beginning of it, I mean, on every issue it says like 1 of 6, 2 of 6, so on. I think this was always, right. I think this was always crafted as a miniseries because it tells a very complete story. I think it could have gone on into a regular series. Maybe it just didn't sell well enough to do so, or maybe they never actually had plans of doing it that way. But I think it certainly could have. I would have definitely loved to have read it. They have done some other Space Ghost comics after this. There was a Green Lantern Space Ghost team-up special. That's also a very fun book. I would recommend anybody to go check that out. Mm-hmm. And then there's another DC comic called Future Quest, right. And Space Ghost has popped up in Future Quest. I haven't read those. So they have used him some more on occasion. Mm-hmm. If this new Scooby-Doo movie is successful, maybe we'll see some Space Ghost in the Hanna-Barbera cinematic universe.
Oh,
that
dear
we're getting.
God. Okay, I can already imagine it. They're going to get the Blue Falcon, Birdman. They're gonna get Space Ghost. They're gonna throw the, what's it called, Frankenstein Jr. in there. They're gonna throw the Robotic Stooges in there.
Oh yeah. I'm waiting for that Wacky Races movie. That's gonna be tight. But
well, at the very least, we got the Speed Racer movie to hold us over.
It's a shame because I know if we do get a Space Ghost movie from that, it's gonna be like a 3D animated comedy, which is fine. But honestly, I would rather have this comic adapted into a movie. This is very cinematic.
Oh, totally. Yeah, this feels like one long movie, in fact, and it ends in a way very similar to, like, say, Batman Begins or like the first Superman movie, where it's like this is the beginning of a whole new series of Space Ghost movies, and in the next story arc they'll face off against like Moltar.
Yeah, or Brack or whatever.
Right.
I would love to see the events just following this, where you have Salomon, who must be dead by the time you get to the original series, if we're counting this all as one continuity. Seeing him like building the Space Ghost lair, because they were kind of hinting at that at the end, and then like Space Ghost training Jan and Jace to go on adventures with him, using all that Peacekeeper training to sort of teach them how to fight space crime.
Right.
That would have all been really interesting stuff to see. Where do they get Blip? That's another huge question. Because
yeah.
Blip the monkey does not show up in this comic at all, which is weird because it would be easy enough just to give them a pet monkey. But maybe maybe the writer just doesn't like Blip. Maybe he just didn't want Blip to be.
Maybe it's just like what like the 2011 Thundercats people did to Snarf, where they just don't make him talk. He's just like a normal cat pet creature among the Thundercats.
Maybe he thought that having a comedic sidekick pet monkey would detract from the serious drama and the emotional weight of the story. Because to be fair, there is a lot of like really real emotion from the children in this book, and maybe having a little monkey running around would distract from that. I could see that perhaps.
Probably,
but yeah. That's the biggest question mark, really. Even more so than the wife having a weird accent is, where's Blip?
Right. What did you do to Blip, you bastard?
Look how they massacred my boy.
What really did to him?
Yeah. So hashtag where's Blip?
Yeah. That's true.
Yeah.
And you know what?
Going back to the.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, finish what you were going to say, because I was about to do another segue, so go ahead and get your thought out.
I just want to know, has this version of Space Ghost been revisited in any way, to your knowledge?
Well, I assume that the Space Ghost who pops up in those other DC books is the same Space Ghost. Because the same guy has been doing the art the whole time, I think.
Uh-huh.
He certainly looks the same. Like I said, I haven't read those Future Quest books. But in the Green Lantern Space Ghost team-up book, he felt like the same character to me. Jan and Jace were not in that book, but I mean, they could have just been at home washing their tights or on another mission or something.
Sure,
yeah,
that's true.
That's easy enough to explain. So, I assume that it's all one Space Ghost. That there's just a DC Comics Space Ghost, and this is his origin.
Right.
But I don't think there's any confirmation on that. So.
Okay then, and so
I need to read those Future Quest books. Maybe there's like a line where he alludes to his backstory and tells us the tale of Temple and all that shit. But
I guess before we move on, I do want to say, like, you know, I love this version of Space Ghost, and this pretty much feels like the definitive version of Space Ghost. Oh, we were talking about the art before, and I wasn't sure what you were going to segue into, but I really want to talk about the covers by Alex Ross.
Go right ahead. We can do that before I move on to my other point about the art.
Okay.
The covers are amazing. I mean, they're Alex Ross, so they're perfect in every way.
They're the most badass Space Ghost has ever looked. And if you ever so much as like Google Space Ghost, you're most likely going to see one of these images right away.
Yeah, just everybody do yourself a favor if you haven't read this before. Which, by the way, there are spoilers. What are you doing? Go read it and then come back.
Maybe we should have said this before, but one interesting thing to note is that a lot of these covers, they're more so geared towards fans of the classic comic. If you look at the cover for issue 4, Zorak and his group are their designs are straight up based on the original designs. And for the cover of issue 6, it's obvious it's meant to allude to what's going to happen to Jan and Jace by showing them in their classic Space Ghost uniforms from the cartoon.
Right. Well, I don't recall which issue it is, but there's the one where it's Space Ghost in front of like a field of stars, and he's sort of half invisible, half visible. And in the background of that image, you can see his ship, which has a name that is escaping me at the moment. But Space Ghost ship, and it looks like the one from the cartoon, which is notable because it looks different in this comic than it did in the cartoon.
Okay.
But on the cover, that is the one out of the cartoon. That is straight up the one from the cartoon. The Phantom Flyer is what it's called. Maybe the scientist guy built him a newer plane after the events of this book.
Yeah, or
who's to say?
Or it's possible that like either Alex Ross is a very biased man, and he's like, no, I want to do my version of Space Ghost. Fuck your version. Or he just never got the notes for what he's supposed to design.
Maybe he just had like story notes and he didn't know what the actual book was going to look like yet.
Yeah, so it's
I don't know.
Yeah, he's like, I'm Alex Ross, so I'm going to do what I want.
Yeah, maybe he just always wanted to do some Space Ghost, and he said, "Damn it, I'm doing classic Space Ghost, and you are gonna like it." And we do. Thank you, Alex.
Yeah.
Please
He definitely
draw anything you want.
He definitely comes off as a strong Space Ghost fan. I know he's a professional, and you're paid to do the best damn job you can possibly do. But I got the feeling that he may have been a fan, given how well all of these covers came out.
Yeah, Alex Ross mostly works with DC, but he's also done some Marvel stuff in the past. And
yeah,
I believe Marvel has. I believe there was a story where Marvel was going to be doing some Ultraman stuff. I would love to see him do that.
Oh yeah, he has done Ultraman stuff, so it'd be great. And they're clearly using his work to promote the fact that Marvel has Ultraman now, the license for Ultraman. So yeah, it'd be cool to see him do that.
So I would love to.
Yeah,
I would love to see them approach him for everything, but at least the covers.
Right, everything. It's such a shame that the one cover they made him do for IDW's Godzilla was like very boring, unfortunately.
Yeah. But yeah, everybody do yourself a favor if you haven't seen them before. Go on to Google and just type in Alex Ross Space Ghost, and you will be treated to a glorious display of artistic just excellence. Alex Ross is a god. We are not worthy.
Indeed. But anyways, carry on with what you were originally wanting to segue into.
Yeah, well, so we were talking about the art before, and there are some inconsistencies. One in particular that you specifically wanted to talk about.
Mm-hmm.
So when Space Ghost first shows up in this comic, he's pretty faithful to the classic Space Ghost look, but there are a few differences, and the major one is that his cape is basically like Robin's cape from Batman the Animated Series. It's black on the outside and yellow lined on the inside, as opposed to the pure yellow cape that he has in the original show.
Right.
And it's a really badass cape.
Yeah.
It's a really cool looking cape. And I would have been fine with them keeping that cape throughout the whole story.
Yeah.
But at some point, in like the 4th or 5th issue, they just switched to doing the regular cape, and there's no explanation. Like, there's never a point where he loses the first cape and then puts on a new cape. It just seems like it's supposed to be the same cape, just drawn differently.
Yeah,
it's sort of frustrating. It's like how it's like when Batman showed up in Static Shock wearing his TMBA costume, even though it was during the Justice League, and it just triggered all of us. It's weird, and it's like, pick one or the other. Either do the black cape with the yellow lining, or just do the plain yellow cape. Either one is fine by me. Just be consistent,
Right.
After he gets to that planet, he just is straight up classic Space Ghost for the rest of the story. Whereas before that, he had this really cool sort of modernized look.
With
it was supposed to reflect the change from... Maybe it was supposed to reflect the change from Space the Crow into the more superhero stuff. But
potentially.
I don't know, it was weird.
Yeah, apologies for the sirens right now, ladies and gentlemen. So it reminded me of, like, I guess it's like, I don't know, it doesn't even come off as like a symbolic change, because I feel like the switch between the black and yellow cape to the pure yellow cape was just, it didn't feel like narratively it was at the right time to make that change. I remember they introduced the mask, which was very cool, the hooded mask, which it reminded me a bit of a cross between like Hooded Justice from Watchmen, along with like a classic medieval executioner's mask, which, went right as fit the theme of him being like you said, the Crow, the person coming for revenge, for vengeance. And then he loses it, and I don't know how he happens to have a mask under his mask, or why he would want a double mask, but this almost feels like a bit like it reminded me a bit of that, one of the early DC animated straight-to-video movies, The New Frontier, where Batman intentionally changes his costume from like the classic black costume to the Silver Age blue costume in order to come off as less intimidating to children. And so if he was hanging around Jan and Jace, that would have been the perfect opportunity to do something like that, to make like some last minute adjustments. But of course the plot is constantly moving, so him losing the unceremoniously losing the hood, and then like having the the cape just randomly changed to yellow. It was very distracting. Not very distracting, but given how it's the design of your main hero, it was distracting to a degree. And to be honest,
what they should have done, I think, is... go ahead.
I was going to say, I like the black and yellow cape a bit more, just because I think the color balance was much more even. I feel like by having the cape and cowl be black, there's enough black and enough yellow and enough red distributed everywhere across the character in order for the colors to fully gel with each other. And as opposed to having a pure yellow cape that just dominates over every other color on the costume. But hey, it's the classic design. I gotta respect it.
Right. I think what they should have done is kept him in the black and yellow cape with like the hooded cowl and all that stuff. Kept him in that look, the more modern look, for the duration of the story. And then when he shows back up at the end, specifically when he like drops Temple off at the commandment headquarters and says, like, get your shit together or I will burn you to the ground, or whatever the actual dialogue
it's like, is. But again, Batman Year One, at this point, none of you are safe.
Yeah, when he shows up in that scene, then I would switch to like the classic Space Ghost look, because at that point he has become the classic Space Ghost. He has become the hero. Whereas throughout the rest of the story,
we don't deserve, but the one we need right now: a silent defender, a watchful guardian, a space ghost. Dun 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 dun.
Exactly. Because the rest of the story is about him becoming that. And so I feel like he should have only donned the classic look after he had already become that, if that makes sense. And it would have been off screen, so we wouldn't have that weird moment where he just pops up on the planet and now he looks different. It's just a weird inconsistency. Doesn't make a whole lot of sense. It's the visual version of the wife's weird accent.
You know what? Maybe it's possible that they knew that this was only going to be a 6-issue series, and the artist just really, really wanted to draw classic Space Ghost.
Maybe. Or maybe he got a note. Maybe somebody was like, hey, we love what you're doing, but can we get a little bit more classic? I don't know.
Maybe. The world may never know.
I would love to sit down with the writer and talk to him about this book, because I'm fascinated to know why some of the things are the way that they are. But yeah, we've been talking for a while, and is there anything else we need to bring up? I feel like we've covered most of it.
Yeah, we've pretty much covered it all, and we're about like an hour and 20 minutes into this.
Yeah, that seems to be about normal for this show. So I guess we'll start to wrap up here. I'm just going over my notes real quick to see if there's anything else I wanted to mention. I think I've hit all these points, so that's good. Yeah, Space Ghost 2005. This is one of my favorite comics. I need to actually buy a physical copy of it. But I love it. Andres, would you fully endorse Space Ghost 2005?
Yes, always. I would say this is perhaps...
Do it!
Just do it! With the exception of Space Ghost Coast to Coast, I feel like this would be the definitive version of Space Ghost for me. I just would love to have I just need a motion comic of this, voiced by I hope I got his name right, George Lowe from Coast to Coast. Because it was so much fun imagining his voice over this version of the character.
Yeah, that would be interesting. I also kind of thought of, and I don't even love him for Batman, honestly, but the performance that Peter Weller gave in Dark Knight Returns, you know, I feel like he could do the Space Ghost as well. I don't know. There's a lot of voice actors who could pull this off.
Or heck, get Gary Owens back to reprise his original role. He was Space Ghost. He was Hawkman. He was Birdman. He was Powdered Toast Man, for crying out loud.
And he's still alive.
He's still. No, he's not. He unfortunately passed away in 2015 at the age of 80. So never mind that. Sorry, well. I apologize, ladies and gentlemen, but we lost a great hero 5 years ago.
this just in. And stop the presses.
Stop the presses. Space Ghost is dead.
Well, thanks, Andres. Now we're ending on a depressing note.
But George Lowe is still alive and healthy. I hope to God.
Yeah, hopefully. Because the other guy isn't. The one that we met at G-Fest, he died.
Oh,
it's very sad.
Yeah. That was very unfortunate. Moltar, Zorak and Moltar, both of them.
Yeah. He was a great guy.
Yeah,
but
we will look to him we will think of him when we look into the moon.
Yeah. So now that we're all depressed, Andres, what are you recommending for the next episode?
So what I like to recommend. So recently, during my trip to and from America during the holidays, I got the chance to watch a movie that had been in production for the last 25 to 30 years. And this film was The Man Who Killed Don Quixote. And for those who don't know, Don Quixote is this like very classic story.
And then the Bigfoot.
Yes. Followed by Hitler. So Don Quixote was a classic tale from Spanish culture, Spain, Spanish culture, and we had Terry Gilliam, I believe that's his name, who wanted to make a movie about it in 1989, and so it took a good 10 years for him to finally get the funding and the investors involved to bring together a version of The Man Who Killed Don Quixote, which was sort of like an adaptation of the story, but it was a story about a filmmaker who's making a movie about Don Quixote and eventually meets a version of him in real life. Through some,
That's right, folks. It's about to get meta.
Yes, it's a super meta take on Don Quixote, and so unfortunately this fell apart, and so for years he's been trying to get this project back off the ground, and it wasn't until 2017 did he finally get a new version of that movie made, and that was the version I watched on the plane ride from America back to Japan. But that's not actually what I want to recommend, because as interesting as the movie is, it's not a movie I can fully endorse. It's almost there, but the pieces just don't fit together. No, instead, what I want to recommend is a documentary. Yes, that's right, ladies and gentlemen. Yet another documentary called Lost in La Mancha, which is a documentary about the failure that was the 2000s attempt at The Man Who Killed Don Quixote. And it just goes to show, it's a really good textbook example of just how a project can go so wrong, and how many projects in Hollywood these days, that you tend to hear many projects that get announced, that get into pre-production or production, but for whatever reason, many of these projects just sadly never come to light. And so this is just a good textbook example, a very educational example at just what happens to these kind of projects when things just don't go the way they should. And so I like to recommend for the next episode, Lost in La Mancha, a documentary chronicling the development of the 2000s version of The Man Who Killed Don Quixote. And yeah, I certainly hope that, Dylan, as a fellow film enthusiast, you may find something interesting about a documentary, a movie about the making of a movie.
It certainly sounds fascinating. Do you know if Terry Gilliam is Spanish or any kind of Spanish?
I'm not quite sure. But
it just struck me. He made this, and then he also made that movie Brazil that everybody talks about. And so I don't know if there's like a Spanish connection here. I mean, he's a white man. Don't get me wrong. I know that, but Spain and also parts of South America.
He is an American. White Spanish. He's an American-born British screenwriter, film director, animator, actor, comedian, former member of the Monty Python comedy troupe, according to Wikipedia. So yeah, he has.
Well, maybe he's just.
Yeah, sorry.
Maybe he's just an enthusiast.
Yeah. He just obviously he had to be an enthusiast in order to spend 30 years of his life trying to put this movie together.
Do they have a word for that? Because if you're if you're an enthusiast for English culture, you're called an Anglophile. And there's like Japanophile or Weeb. So is there like a Spanglophile? Is that a
Jesus Christ?
What do you call?
I would have no idea, man, because normally you never see that sort of dedication. You never see people who are actively wanting to join Spanish or Latin culture. Which I'm not sure if I should see that as a good thing or a bad thing. Oh boy, but I'm not Spanish. I'm Mexican.
Well, it's all spun off from the same branch.
Maybe, my friend. Maybe.
I'm not Greek, but there's a whole lot of that going on in my culture. You know what I mean? A lot of all that Western philosophy and junk. You know.
Right. So, ready to head out, my friend?
Certainly.
Oh, I forgot to mention that I would say, going back to Space Ghost, this is, the definitive version of Space Ghost, and I highly recommend anybody to check it out. And I just really wish that we get a return to this version of Space Ghost in some way, shape, or form.
Absolutely. I would love to see it. I would love to see this become a full-fledged series. I don't read comics month to month usually, but I might if you made Space Ghost a thing. DC, want my money? As if my sales alone would be enough to justify the cost of producing said comic, but a man can dream.
Also, American comics, the American comic industry is sort of kind of going down the shitter at the moment.
True.
Yep.
You hate to see it.
Anyways.
Yeah. So that's going to wrap up this episode of Fully Endorsed. Join us next time when we talk about Lost in La Mancha. I have been Super DM64.
I have been Andres Perez, aka Kaiju Noir.
And ladies and gentlemen, that's exactly the way it's been.
Take care, everybody.